All right, so for our final part right here, coming back, again, we're going to talk about retrieval. So we've already talked about this model of memory. We've talked about the different types of memory that are there, the different types of implicit, explicit memory, especially in working memory. And we talked about encoding information. So now again, we're going to focus on retrieval. So how do you retrieve or remember information? How do you get it out of your long-term memory? So a couple of the ways that you can do that is to give yourself cues. Remember, retrieval is essentially just remembering information. So retrieving it from long-term memory just means that retrieving it from long-term memory just means that we are remembering the information. So a first way that you can do that is by priming, again, giving yourself that association, starting yourself off. So usually this would be like the order of test questions. Now in AP psychology, they figured this out, so they don't do this on your tests. But you've taken tests before where it has gone in order of units. Earlier questions are related to first, second unit, all the way up to the most recent, right? You also have context-dependent memory. So context, again, is where you are, what's happening. So sometimes if you've ever noticed that you've seen a teacher outside of school or somebody like a classmate from school, but you can't quite figure out who it is, like you see them in, like, let's say the grocery store, and you're staring at them and you're like, oh, I know I recognize them, but I can't place where. This is a context-dependent memory, right? So it's kind of putting that together. So seeing someone in school, you're going to have that memory come back a little bit quicker. You're going to be able to retrieve it a little bit faster. You also then have state-dependent memory. So state-dependent memory means that the state you are in when you are encoding the information, you'll be able to retrieve that information faster if you're in the same state. So for example, if while you are studying this information in psychology, you're eating peppermints, you want to make sure you're eating peppermints when you take a test, right? Because you were in that state while you were studying. So then eating peppermints then as you're going through and taking the test will help. Now, this is state-dependent memory, so this doesn't mean that peppermints just equal retrieval, right? It has to be the same as when you were studying. So if you are super sleepy while you are studying for a test, if you come in ready for that test wide awake, you're not going to remember that information as clearly, right? Vice versa. If you are studying sitting on a bed or lounging back and kind of being comfy, if you are able to do that during a test, more power to you, but you probably are just going to be sitting up, and so you won't be in that same state dependent. So when you study, you want to try to recreate the conditions of the test to help you remember that a little bit better. The same can be said for your mood. So state dependent memory is also mood congruent memory, meaning if you are annoyed and frustrated at a family member and then sit down to go study, well, coming in to take the test, if you're fine, you're content, you're not really stressed, you're actually going to remember the information a little bit less than you would if you came in with that same level of frustration. Similarly, you could remember the information later, like you come home, you get frustrated again, all of a sudden you have that insight learning, that aha moment, you're remembering the information. So you can kind of see that popping up with it, right? You'll also have a serial position effect, which contains the recency and primacy. So serial position means depending on when you learned the information, you're going to remember it in that order. Okay, so recency effect, you will most likely remember the last thing that you studied or the last thing you went over. Primacy effect, you'll most likely remember the first thing you studied and went over. The whole middle part there is going to be blurry. So we tend to remember recent and we tend to remember first, but then you kind of have this blur in between, right? And we can see that here. So if I were to ask people, okay, to memorize a certain amount of words in a list, okay, and then we go through and look at the age of the words recalled, what we're going to see is the immediate recall. So learning that information, you'll get pretty high going through for the first information. As you go through and get more words on a list, it goes down. You have a little bit of a spike, but then when we get close to this end, you can see you remember most of it as it's coming up with immediate recall, right? So you remember pretty much the first that you've learned and then the very, very last. However,
If you wait and don't rehearse this information as much, you'll still remember the first, definitely not as much. Still have this low break, kind of pick up a little bit. You get a little bit of a spike similar to here, but if you take a little bit of time, if you don't rehearse it, you'll see you don't have it, right? So we remember a lot of it's in the beginning, the most recent, still over time it fades. Again, if you're not rehearsing the information, you're not encoding it, you're not going to be storing it into your long-term memory. Now, part of this that comes up, people will often talk about this photographic memory. Okay, the exact term is eidetic memory. Very few people have this, right? Most of us do kind of suffer from overconfidence though, and we will say, oh, I have a great memory. Yes, I can totally go through and have photographic. You can even be listening to this right now and be thinking, oh, wait, Missy, like I totally know I have that. This would be if I asked you to look at these two pictures. I click away from the screen real quick. Would you be able to draw this out exactly as you see it, as you saw it, and get it exactly, right? If you can, awesome, right? If you can't, you don't have photographic memory, right? That is part that we tend to go through and think that we really have this, but again, we don't. Most of that we can see is working memory. Again, you're only storing a handful of materials and you're only being able to retrieve a handful of those materials. So for our time now, this is it. So if you have any questions kind of coming up on retrieval, this is the information for it. If you have any questions on encoding or the memory process as a whole, let me know. Make sure you're reading through modules 34, 35 to make sure you keep this information, make sure it's fresh, make sure it's working for you. Right?